I don't know the comms, sign language. Good evening. Good evening, folks. My name is Ed Perkins. I'm part of the Reconciliation Committee at Second Baptist Church. We thought that this was a very timely and important issue to discuss, immigration in the United States, and so we found the best person locally to talk to us about that. His name is Dr. Miguel Lavario, teaches at Texas Tech, emphasis in borderland studies, the southerly border. And so we want to welcome him here now so we can be a little bit more informed.
That's a great idea. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to have to hire Edward for my PR stuff. He's going to say he's the best to do this. I don't know about that, but I'll surely try my best to inform everybody. And I was looking at this title. Well, first let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Miguel Levario. I'm an associate professor of U.S. history at Texas Tech. I specialize in U.S.-Mexico borderlands history, as well as Mexican-American history. Been here at Tech for now going on 18 years. Time flies when you're having fun, I guess. I'm originally from El Paso, Texas, but my wife and I moved here from Austin, where I got my PhD at the University of Texas. I've talk a lot about the border, and people say like, oh, there's a lot of stuff going on. I say, yeah, so it keeps me employed. So I'm really happy about that. But what I wanted to do today is I kind of looked at this title and I thought, it's not really the best choice of words there. Because what I wanted to do was put things into context, right? So that when we talk about immigration, when we talk about quote unquote border security, we kind of understand what it really is, as opposed to the sort of hyperbole that is often used to describe it, because it is largely a politicized topic. And it has been for quite some time. It hasn't been because of the current administration, the previous administration, or 2016, or 2012, or 2001. It's always been, right? And it's one of the things I wanted to mention is that the United States, since the beginning, has had a very conflicted and a very complicated relationship with immigration, right? We have our very romanticized idea of Ellis Island, people talking about, oh, my great-grandparents or my grandparents, came with just on their back, they came to work hard. Yeah, that's pretty much everybody who comes through here most of the time, right? It doesn't matter if they're from Southern and Eastern Europe or Western Europe or from China or from Latin America. They're generally, mostly people are coming here because things back home aren't great, right? And one of the things that we want to put in context is that migration is a human act. We all migrate. I migrated here. I migrated to Lubbock because it was the best opportunity for me, for my family. Our students, I tell our students, you migrate to come to Texas Tech. There's, I'm sure, a university closer to where you live. Why didn't you go there? Well, you came here because it was a better opportunity for you, right? And even the behaviors that we use, we associate with immigrants, like, oh, but they're living in a poor situation. There's like 8 of them in 1-bedroom apartments, and that's not healthy and that's not safe. Well, don't you have a roommate? Aren't you getting roommates so you can split the cost because it's expensive to live in Tech Terrace or wherever, right? So we all do this, right? It's a human behavior. We've been doing it since we've been able to walk on 2 feet, right? So I want to sort of historicize a little bit about immigration with the United States. I can't go back too far because else we'll be here for a long time. And you get a professor talking, we're not going to stop talking. So I want to try to protect you from me. So in some ways, I wanted to contextualize this in these phrases that we hear. For example, illegal immigrants are flooding our borders. Illegal immigrants are abusing our resources or taking up too many resources. They don't pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera. These are not new statements or arguments that have been made. They're not. And they have literally been used since the 19th and 18th century, right? Whether it's towards Germans, Benjamin Franklin infamously said that they are dirty, inassimilable, lazy, drink too much. I mean, that's something we've said about pretty much almost every ethnic group coming in here that wasn't, related to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, right? So all the way down to some of the things I'll talk about today with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and some other policies that really come into form in the late 19th century because of what was actual immigration, a surge in immigration in the late 19th century, which we have not even come close to meeting in recent time. It may seem like it, according to mainstream media or any kind of media outlet, quite frankly, that, they're flooding our borders, we're leaving the doors open, there's everybody coming in. No, that happened in 1880 when people from Europe were coming in, right? And we haven't even come close to those numbers. So a couple of things I wanted to sort of put into context, right? We have a U.S. foreign-born population that reached a record number, 47.8 million in 2023. This is both considered to be a guesstimate of undocumented or unauthorized immigrants because we can only guesstimate. So when you hear a number, it is a guess. Why? Because they're undocumented. They're not supposed to exist. So we don't know exactly how many there are. And the formula that the Department of Homeland Security uses is very basic. It's how many people applied for visas, and how many people returned, and what's the gap? Because we can't count how many people are coming around the ports of entry. We don't know. Can't be everywhere at once. So that's it. That's how you get the number. So that's why it fluctuates. You hear 30 million, 20 million, 10 million, because they're all using those very vague numbers for their own sort of purpose, right? But regardless of what we're looking at here, we're looking at about 47.8 million. We live in a country that's almost 340 million. So we're talking about a very small number of people here. And if we want to talk about the undocumented or the unauthorized, you're looking around 3% of the population that is supposedly we're concerned about, right? So largest annual increase in 20 years since 2000. And we've had these types of dramatic increases and decreases since, again, the 18th and 19th century. What we're going to see with immigration is that it's going to ebb and flow throughout history. And then there are a number of factors that lead to that, right? More recently for us, the COVID pandemic had a huge impact, right? You can see some in Washington argue like, well, it was at its lowest in 2020. Yeah, because we literally shut down the border. Not only were people not coming through, but not even goods were coming through. And they're like, well, they didn't increase after 2020. Yeah, because we opened everything back up, right? And then we have to think about economic factors. We look at the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, when the economy was booming. We had an increase in migration because employers were demanding more workers, both undocumented and undocumented. Then we have the Great Recession of 2006, 2007. Things fall because why? They're not coming here because there's no jobs, right? So there's a number of factors that contribute. So when we see this annual increase, yeah, since 20 years, but 9/11 is also going to change that. I don't know, I'm old enough to remember when I just needed my driver's license to go to Mexico or to just go to Canada, right? That's no longer. 9/11 changed all that. And when we look at policies and restrictive policies, they're going to also contribute to the increase in unauthorized and undocumented immigration, right? Which makes sense. So we're looking at the number of immigrants living in the United States was about a fifth of what it is today. That's largely in part because, well, populations grow. The geopolitics of the world also changed. This is also this is a post-World War II era. This is the middle of the Cold War. This is also nearing the end, not really the end, but it's nearing, the major involvement of the United States in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. That's going to lead an increase of refugees escaping those areas to the United States. But we're also seeing, the Cold War is in full effect, so that's going to also add. But in 1965, we have the Immigration Act of 1965 that changed the way we dealt with immigration. Prior to this, in 1924, we had the Immigration Act of 1924, which was a quota act, that we literally put a number of how many people can legally come from a particular country. Right? This was racially motivated. That's been very evident. We have evidence to prove that. So when we had those restrictions, it also created the Border Patrol as well, right? The first time the United States had a law enforcement entity to enforce immigration law. This is in 1924. In 1965, under the Johnson administration, they decided to get rid of the Quota Act. When we got rid of the Quota Act, we saw a significant increase coming from Latin America. We look at this time period in the 60s, the 70s, you have Cuba, you have parts of Central America that are also going through some change with both communist influences, those who are trying to resist communist influences, like El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and those other places, also in South America as well. Mexico is also going through a transition economically, not necessarily politically, but certainly economically. So that's going to increase. And then, so we see after 1965, that the bulk of immigration is not really coming from Europe, but coming from the South, okay? So when we talk about Mexican migration especially, it doesn't really pick up until about that time. Now, we do have in the 1910s and 1920s where we have the largest influx of Mexican migration into the United States because of the Mexican Revolution, right? But prior to that, we don't really see a lot, but I'll get to that in a second. Okay, you see immigrants here make up about 14.3% of the U.S. population, a roughly threefold increase from 1970. The share of population today is the highest since 1910. You'll notice it says 1910. Between 1870 and 1920, so we had the largest influx of immigration in the United States history. And that was because at the bulk of at the height of what we call the Industrial Revolution. Right? The United States is modernizing, it's booming. There is a huge demand for labor, more importantly, inexpensive labor. And so immigrants are coming in from Canada, coming from Europe, and there's also a concern there because a lot of the ones that are coming from Europe, they're Catholic. And there is a very, very strong sense of fear that they're going to take over the country and install the Pope as our leader. You laugh, but that was actually a fear, right? So we have all these different sort of responses to these influxes, but as we see here, they essentially all kind of integrate, right? But in large part, they integrate because of the restrictions. In 1924, it's like, okay, no more Italians, no more Polish, no more Germans, nobody more can come in. Except they left the Mexicans out. Why? Because they're allies, they're friends? No. They were actually lobbying to not have them come in. But Texas farmers go to Washington, D.C. and say, if you stop our labor flow, we will fold up and die. So John Box was able to do that and keep Mexicans off of the restriction rolls, right? So again, going about politics, right? Because there's also the language of, well, we got to protect. We don't have the resources. New York, Chicago, Boston are all sort of struggling because they don't have resources to take care of these immigrants. That is true, yes. But the thing is, like, that's not really the case. The case is that these employers want the inexpensive labor. And you're like, well, why are they taking those low-paying jobs? When you have zero, $1 more, right? If you don't have anything and somebody says, well, I'll give you $1, well, then, okay, that's one more dollar than I had before. Nobody likes to work for less, right? And I want to put that because the immigrants aren't here saying, yes, pay me less, pay me less. I want fewer things, and I want to struggle to eat and feed my family. I love that. It sounds ridiculous. Nobody says that. But if you're already starving, then you have very few choices, right? So this idea that we need to kind of put in is like humanizing and contextualizing all these different factors. You're like, wow, you're going all over the place. It's like, yes, this is a complicated issue. It is all over the place, right? So to this very day, the largest represented groups of migrants, both authorized and unauthorized, are going to be from Mexico, right? And that's both because of history, because of our tied economic relationship, or at least up to now. We have a number of reasons why that is. Proximity is another, right? And this is also going to complicate the immigrant experience for a lot of either Mexican or Mexican Americans or even Latinos, but generally Mexicans, because this is something different from what Italian Americans, and Polish and Germans, you can say, well, they kind of integrated, like they became American. Well, it's a long distance from Poland to the United States. From Mexico to here, if you're from El Paso like I am, it's literally steps away, right? So this idea of reinforcement of those communities is more constant than it was for Europeans who were restricted from entry, right? So in other words, the generations of those born in the United States become greater and greater than they would say for ethnic Mexicans, right? Although that is changing. And it has been changing since 2001, where a larger number of those who identify as Mexican American are going to be third, fourth, fifth generation in the United States, born in the United States, right? So we're starting to see those trends that we saw with Europeans from the 19th century and early 20th century. But then again, we're still seeing an influx of migrants coming in from Mexico, right? The next largest group you notice here is India and China, the Philippines, and then El Salvador, right? And it's only 3%. Venezuelans come after that at 2%. So when we look at this influx, we have to put it in perspective and look at those numbers. When you look at 23% of all U.S. immigrants are from Mexico, the next highest is 6%. Right? I mentioned that here. So as I mentioned about flows, they go up and down, up and down, up and down. And this kind of gives you from 2000, we're seeing up and down, up and down. And you can say, whoa, this is dramatic. This is where when people say, well, statistics don't lie. It's like, well, no, they don't lie. It's how you interpret them that where the lie might come out, right? So we can say here, this is January of 2020, right? Right before the pandemic hits. It is at a low here, but it was the same way during the Obama administration. And in fact, when the Obama administration had ended in 2016, we see it at its lowest. In fact, we had a net zero. In other words, when we come to people coming in and leaving, we were at zero. So when the next administration came in after that, they will argue like, oh, we had it at the lowest in 2017, 2018. It's like, actually, no, you inherited that. And things changed because of the rhetoric. People were starting to like, let's get in before things start coming to fruition. So you see an increase, right? And then we start moving down here in 2020, 2021, when the pandemic hits and the border is literally closed, right? Then you can say, well, look at the dramatic increase here. Well, yeah, because the pandemic was deemed to be either over or controlled. Things started to change. You all remember, you can say, well, why did they open the border up to people? It's like, well, because we couldn't get things either. Goods weren't coming in. It's like one of the great paradoxes of American border policy is that we want everything closed but open. Shut down the border. Well, we all remember when that happened, especially when Governor Abbott did it, and things were stuck at the border and we couldn't get our things that we ordered on Amazon. Or we couldn't get the fruits in our grocery stores. So we can't have it both ways. We can't have it closed, but then open. And NAFTA and NAFTA 2.0 tell us politically we want open, right? So we have these various changes. So we just trying to look at this, like I said, it's just to give you an idea of some of the difference. So just when you look at this, put in context, what is happening at that time, right? What is happening at that time? It's not to say when policy of whichever administration is in office doesn't work. It's just that likely it's not what it presents it to be, at least not fully, right? Because we are dependent as a country, as an economic system on that flow. If we don't have it, a lot of things are going to be affected, right? And I mean like things that we deal with every single day. So this idea that we have open borders. There's that, and I forgot to put it on here, but there's this wonderful political cartoon in 1899 that has Uncle Sam standing at a wall or gate, and there's this poor, decrepit man. He's got all this stuff on him, and he's got all these anarchists, communists, disease. What immigrants are bringing to the United States, because we don't have disease in the United States. Only immigrants bring that. I'm glad you guys caught on to the sarcasm. But anyway, Uncle Sam is standing right there. This is in 1899. He's standing out there like, no. Although the government says you can, but I'm saying no, right? And it's this sort of kind of hypocrisy and it's a bit of contradiction, because behind him, you'll see they have a building with smoke coming out, meaning there's employers here who actually recruited him to come over here, right? So we have a lot of that. We still have that today. Walmart's probably one of the biggest culprits. And of course, the food processing industry are one of the largest, if not the largest culprit when it comes to recruiting both authorized and unauthorized immigrants into the United States. And that's been going on in the United States forever. They call them, actually the Greek community was very active in that in the 19th century. They call them padrinos. And of course, other ethnic groups would do it. Essentially what it meant is that a company, and back then it was usually a railroad company, would hire somebody who was probably Greek American or that of that ethnicity, who could speak both Greek and English, American English, and could navigate and would be sent to Greece, recruit, get people to work at Southern Pacific. He gets a little cut because he's basically a labor recruiter. But he also gets a cut from the guys that he recruited. It's like, hey, I housed you for a couple of days until they sent you out to Utah. And I'm going to need money for the clothes and all the stuff I get. It's a very lucrative business. And we still have them today. We still have those individuals, both authorized and unauthorized labor recruiters to this very day that are occupied, they're employed. Anyway, we talk about encounters. In the Pew Research study where this information comes from, is what they define as encounters is essentially any point of contact the Border Patrol has with somebody who is not entering through a recognized port of entry. So that's what we're talking about here, right? And so after reaching a record high in the end of 2023, the monthly number of U.S. Border Patrol encounters with migrants across the United States have plummeted by January of 2024, right? So I put this in there because, as you all remember, during the campaign season and during the pre-election, there was this constant barrage of statements saying the Biden administration believes in open borders, our borders are wide open. That couldn't be further from the truth, right? Do we have unauthorized migration into the country? Yes, we do. That's going to happen regardless. We cannot stop it to zero, period. We cannot. If you're desperate, you're going to do whatever you can to get over here or get somewhere. Right? So we can't stop it completely. However, we do see that there are both executive orders that were passed by the administration. You also have Mexico, who is also doing their part in limiting the flow coming into the country, because they are also involved in partnering with the United States in limiting that flow coming up from their borders themselves, their southern border. So you have a number of factors that are playing in, and of course some enforcement, some increased enforcement, and also the promotion of that as well happening. That's going to lead to that decrease. But we look at 58,000 encounters with migrants crossing the U.S. border in August 2024. That's a 77% decrease from December of 2023, the most ever recorded in a single month. Again, we are going to see numbers be higher and higher just because populations are growing, and of course geopolitics around the world are also changing as well. But you do see up, down, right? Just one real quick point I want to make. See what my time is here. 2016 unauthorized immigration numbers. What we're looking at, one of the points I want to make with this actually goes back a little bit further. As I mentioned with 9/11, 9/11 did change the game completely. The idea of free going back and forth pretty much disappears. Both if you are, a legal resident of the United States, you can use your driver's license. That goes away. You need passports now, or at least some type of federal document to go back and forth now. After 2001, the other thing that it did is that it disrupted and almost halted the volunteer return by immigrants that are coming into the United States undocumented. What I mean by that is that what was very common was that if those who entered outside the ports of entry to go to work in the field, to go pick our fruits and vegetables, work their seasons or a couple of seasons, and voluntarily go back because, of course, they've been away from their families for months on end and want to go see them, be there for a few months, and then come back to work. And it was really self-regulated, right? And it was a constant. 9/11 stopped all that because you have, of course, the Department of Homeland Security that is organized. You have this larger emphasis on enforcement on the southern border. So the idea of going back going back to Mexico and returning to the United States became far more difficult. And the likelihood of you getting caught or having to deal with fines or imprisonment had increased dramatically. So what happens? Most of them stay here. And they just send the remittance, but they very rarely will go home. So when we see that policy happen, we see like, oh, well, we just got attacked. Well, not from the southern border. As the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, said, they didn't come from Mexico, right? So this emphasis on the Mexican border is not exactly what's addressing the 9/11 attacks, but we did. We have the Secure Fence Act, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, 2006. So when that happens, it disrupted this natural back and forth that was happening. And we talk about, well, why don't we have something like that, like just contract labor, they can come here for a few months and then go back home. We did have it. It's called, the Bracero program. We had it even a non-regulated way with people doing it naturally themselves, especially Mexican migrants. So with 9/11, Mexican migration will decrease a little bit, but what's happening is that we now see an increase on long-term stays. They're just not going to go back, right? This is also going to increase, as I mentioned before, the number of those of Mexican descent that are starting to be, born here. You have third, fourth generation, no longer first generation immigrants, anything like that. Not actually, you don't no longer, but just that number is decreased, right? Because they're staying here. And then they have families, right? They've been here. They meet somebody, they fall in love, they have kids, right? So that's also a complication of just a natural human thing, right? The wall, the famous wall, infamous wall. Not an original idea. I'm starting to feel like Marco Rubio a little bit. Poor guy, that was kind of bad. The complications of building an obstruction along natural terrain. This probably gets one of the most criticism by scholars, by scientists, by geologists, by everybody, because it is not only archaic. I mean, we talk about the medieval times, it's like, let's build a wall and how to climb it. It's like, with technology, even like basic technologies we've seen, they just dig underneath, right? It's not gonna work. But we have this concept of we build a wall, we'll be safe, and nothing bad will happen ever again, right? So, this concept, although it's not new, it was introduced by the army in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. We have documents of reports from officers that were stationed in Fort Bliss arguing that if we had a bit of a fencing or wall and obstruction, then we could limit the flow of migrants coming in. Now, mind you, we don't have a border patrol at that time in 1910 through 1920, right? But they say, well, if we do that and build a road, we can transverse that area, the U.S.-Mexico border, a little bit easier. So we have those kinds of early suggestions of some type of parameter there. But it really comes into fruition in post 9/11 with the 2006 Secure Fence Act, right? The idea is to build a wall from San Diego to Brownsville. Now, as I tell my students, what's the problem with that? What? It's a lot of wall. First of all, the people who are in construction are the ones you're trying to keep out. That's a little half joke there. Those of you who are familiar with Big Bend, how easy is it going to be to build a fence through the Big Bend area? right? Now there's another complication. There's a Tohono O'odham reservation that sits on the border between Arizona and Sonora. You're going to have to get their permission, and they're going to want to work with the federal government after decades, if not centuries, of working with them and not necessarily things coming the way they're supposed to happen. They already said no, you're not. So there's a gap. That's one. That's two. The other, there's two more that we'll talk about. There's far more, but two more. The other one is, what people don't realize is that animals don't understand policy. So when we have that, the natural migration of animals, various animals going across our imaginary border, which is it's a superficial thing. The Rio Grande is not a border, it's a river that we assign a border to. But it's just a river, just like any other river in the world, right? So it is superficial, but animals don't understand that. We also have ranchers on both sides of the border that have agreements to allow their I'm not from the farm, so was it flock? Livestock. No, I know it's livestock, but the herd is what I was looking for. Yeah, I'm from the city, it doesn't. So they have their herd, and they have made agreements to go back and forth. It's become so important that even in the places that do have fencing, have a gate to allow that to happen, right? So that they can go back and forth to eat and graze, right? That's the other problem. The other problem is that's my private property. You want to build what? Where? Right? And then it got sticky for the Bush administration because in South Texas, those private property owners were donors. And you're about to put a big, ugly steel fence on my property. No. Oh, you're right. Sorry. We still want that donation, so no. So wait a minute. We're going to build a wall to protect us, but it's going to have gaps, right? Because of a number of other complications. So we have this very important moment that really highlighted the sort of short-sightedness of this idea. This is a former president of UT Brownsville, which is no longer UT Brownsville, it's University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. President Julieta Garcia, because she challenged the federal government. Why? Well, those of you who are familiar with that area, UT Brownsville literally sits on the border. Like, this is the campus, there's Matamoros, right? UTEP is similar to that. If you've been to UTEP, but divides UTEP from Juarez is I-10. And then the pobrecito Rio Grande, it's not really, more like Rio Pequeño or something. It's not really, it's more like a ditch. I'm from El Paso, we can say that. It's not really a rio. But regardless, Brownsville is even closer, right? So when we talk about this so-called fencing or wall, they're not going to build a wall on the banks of the river. I mean, those of you who have some idea of construction, that's not going to be sturdy enough, and it's going to be more expensive to go even lower. So you got to build it back. So what it meant is that they were going to literally run a fence through the campus of UT Brownsville. And this is not an exaggeration. If those of you are familiar with the tech campus, imagine a big steel fence running between the library and the student union building, going all the way across to the stadium, going through the stadium. I'm dead serious. That's what it would look like, right? And people are going to be like, yes, because of national security. No. So she says, no, you can't do that. We are a binational, bicultural campus. This is state land. She wasn't getting much support from the state at this point either. But she brought a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, or whoever it was that was organizing this, and won. Now, after this, she wasn't the only one. So with the way they had organized it, they were going to go through the River Bend Golf Club and Resort that's adjacent to the UT Brownsville. You're familiar with that? I played there. You played there? Well, you almost couldn't play there, right? Used to. They were like, wait a minute, we just bought land that's now going to be on the southern part of the wall with 230 lots and I think another 9-hole course. And they were like, well, and of course their owner was a very strong donor. So they suspended that project, right? And then I mentioned the Tohono O'odham. So you see all these problems, right? The sort of short-sightedness and the idea that if you're going to have a wall, it's not really going to be as effective as one would think, right? And we've been doing this since New Spain. Their idea was we can build a bunch of presidios and forts along what is now East Texas to prevent British and French people from invading our claimed territory, and they didn't do it. Why? They didn't have materials? Partly. It's kind of hard to send stuff from Mexico City all the way up to Nacogdoches back then. But what they ultimately had to accept was, what we have to accept today is what? It's freaking expensive. Because it's not only about constructing, it's about what? Maintaining and maintenance. And then, of course, things change over time. So all these come into play when we talk about these particular ideas and these proposals that have been going on and been done for centuries and centuries. And that's why I'm saying I don't want to necessarily pick on the last 10 or 15 years, but we look at this historically, we can see that we have kind of haven't really progressed much in how we understand what boundaries mean, what borders mean, all that kind of stuff, right? It's a very complicated issue. Another big one, violent crime. This is probably one of the most age-old, most common comments made. Violent crime rates increase because of immigrants. Thankfully, we have had numerous studies over decades studying this. And ultimately, what it comes down to is no. And if we want to sort of synthesize a little bit about, well, how, when we see it on TV, this undocumented immigrant, killed this young college girl when driving drunk. Yes, that happens. It also happens by U.S. citizens who do the same thing. So it doesn't mean that immigrants don't commit crimes. That's not the point. The point is, and what the studies have indicated, is that we're not seeing an increase in violent crimes. And in fact, recently, violent crimes in the United States have actually dropped across the country. So that rhetoric is inaccurate, right? That rhetoric is not necessarily addressing the idea that immigrants cause crime. Now, to put it in perspective, do we have instances in the past and even today where that kind of happens in places? Maybe, where you might have a higher density of immigrants, that we may have a higher crime rate. Does that happen? Yes. But does it happen because they're immigrants? No. As most sociologists will tell you, no, it's because of lack of opportunity. If you replace those immigrants with just U.S. citizens who don't have any money, you're going to see the same thing. Baltimore, Maryland. Right? So we look at all these different contexts, and we sort of have to understand that to simply and reduce it, to be reductive and say that immigrants are causing this is not remotely close to addressing the issue that we're probably having, right? So we have, going back here, Henry Cabot Lodge in the late 19th century to Donald Trump, anti-immigrant politicians have repeatedly tried to link immigrants to crime, but our research confirms that this is a myth and not based on actual fact. Today, immigrants are 30% less likely to be incarcerated than our US-born individuals who are white, the study finds. This is out of Stanford University. And then one of the other conclusions that came out is that you're more than likely to be killed by a US citizen than an immigrant of any type of status, right? And that just depends on where you are because of gun laws and what have you. And this is just, again, what I mentioned earlier, what we found, that when we really look at the numbers, 6% violent crimes have gone down 6% in the fourth quarter of 2023 compared to the same time the year before. 13% decline in murders, 4% drop in property rates, and so forth, right? This is the quote here, a 2020 study. 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent, US-born citizens are more likely to be arrested for violent crimes than non-US. And you want to look at it just very simply. If you're undocumented, what's the last thing you want? Attention. So you're less likely to commit a crime because you don't want attention. They're probably the safest drivers we have out there, right? They're the ones that are going the speed limit. Damn it. I'm sorry. I'll go to confession next week and hopefully I'll get covered. So all jokes aside, what we're looking at is that this idea that they commit crimes or they contribute to increased violent crimes is fundamentally not accurate, right? Again, we don't speak in absolutes. We don't say they're all going to be not committing. No, not that. But we're just saying, generally speaking, when we look at those types of comments. So what now? This is to close the end of the talk, and I apologize. I told you I would not stop talking. So, birthright citizenship. I wanted to bring this up because it, of course, came up very recently. We all know it's not. You need a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution. At least most of us know that. But looking at birthright citizenship, many people argue, well, that was in reference to the formerly enslaved people who were now going to be given citizenship. That is true. That is the historical context of where that came from. But the framers of that amendment were very much aware of immigrants at that time as well, because they were dealing with immigrants coming in from Ireland and Germany in the 1860s at that time. So what to do with them when we talk about their position and status in the United States? So to reduce that conversation to like, well, that's just anything to do with the former enslaved people. Yes, but that's not the only conversation they were having. We've got to give them at least some credit, right? So as the end of the 19th century was coming to a close, there was a strong, strong movement of anti-Asian, specifically anti-Chinese sentiment. It comes to fruition in what's known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It is the first and only time in the United States to this very day that we prohibited the entry of a specific nationality into this country. But there were exceptions. If you were a diplomat, a merchant, or you had family already here, you were allowed entry. It was really aimed at the working class, at laborers, right? It will last until 43. Why? Did we all of a sudden think like, hey, this is not a good idea, it's kind of wrong? No, what's happening in 1943? World War II, the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. We need an ally against the Japanese, the Chinese. So we wouldn't really go over well diplomatically if we're like, hey, help us out, but don't come here. Essentially, that's what Roosevelt does, is he lifts it because it's like we kind of need them politically, right? I'm grossly simplifying it, but you kind of get the idea. Anyway, back to this. So the nativists and the lobbyists in Washington needed a case to try to limit birthright citizenship, meaning that your parents had to have been born here in order for you to have citizenship, which is an argument that's being put out there today, right? If you have parents who are undocumented, you're supposed to be not eligible to be. That's exactly what happened here. So this is Wong Kim Ark. He is a U.S. citizen, born and raised in San Francisco. Would often go back to China to visit with family. He always carried because back then all residents of Chinese descent had to carry their documents on them to prove that they were legally in the United States. So he would do this, and one time, during this time, I don't know if that's me, he got held up and he got arrested. Because they said, your papers are fraudulent, this is not true, you are entering the country illegally. So this civic organization called the Five Companies took his case to defend him and hired some of the best lawyers in California. And essentially what they argued was, in the Constitution, it doesn't say if your parents were born here. It says if you are in the jurisdiction of the United States, you automatically get citizenship if you were born in the jurisdiction of the United States. And I tell students this, it's like, for those of you who are US citizens and were born here, what did you have to do to get your citizenship? Nothing. We're just lucky to be born here. We didn't have to, we're not obligated to join the military. We're not obligated to pay a fee or pay a certain tax or anything like that. You just have to literally be lucky enough to be born here. And even then, you don't even have to be born here. The Supreme Court proved it when they said Ted Cruz can run for president as long as you are coming out of a woman who was born here, even if it's in another country. Right? So that's it. And so ultimately, when they argued this case, in what was actually a very conservative, and back then it was a race, because they also, the ones that decided on the Dred Scott case of slaves, said he is a citizen. They were one of the most conservative, one of the most racist courts we've had in our history, actually voted in his favor, right? Because the question was like, well, how far do we go back? What if a grandparent was not here legally? So then does that make my parents who were born here illegally here, not citizens? So then it started getting kind of complicated. And then you're saying, well, they're not, so the argument against Wong Kim Ark, was that, well, since his parents weren't born here, they're subjects to China, therefore they're not subjects of the United States. But they're under the jurisdiction, so it doesn't mean just because you come here and you're not a citizen, you can do whatever you want. You can go commit a crime, you're not going to be prosecuted. That's absolutely untrue, correct? Doesn't matter what your status is. If you commit a crime, you're going to be prosecuted because you're under the jurisdiction of the United States. We can't selectively pick which laws we're going to follow and which ones we don't, right? You're under the jurisdiction of the law, or the United States, you have to follow the law. And that was what they based their argument on. So he was born here, he's a citizen here, right? There's no other stipulation there for that. So for that argument and what the judge had ultimately put an injunction on the executive order recently did references is we've already discussed this and all the arguments presented by the administration on why this should be executed as law when it's not. Because first of all, it's the Constitution. He said this is unconstitutional. It's not the way executive orders work, right? So we have that. Really very quickly, I know I'm really well over time and I apologize. Drain on our state and national financial resources, as has been well documented. Undocumented immigrants receive less than what they have put in, okay? Does it mean that our county hospitals aren't feeling the brunt of having to deal with uninsured people? Yes, but the large majority of those that come in without insurance are US citizens who are not insured, especially in a state that leads an uninsured population, right? So when we say that, if you were, and then like, so this idea of like, well, we're not gonna treat, which is against the Hippocratic Oath and the whole nine, so that's not gonna happen, but we're not gonna treat immigrants, the dent it's gonna do in the amount of cost for hospitals is gonna be quite small. Because the majority of those who are quote unquote sucking the finances are actually US citizens, right? So we have that they contribute billions of dollars every year because we're in tax season. Undocumented immigrants also pay taxes. Even if they're using a fake ID, they're paying taxes because they have a paycheck. They pay FICA and Social Security and the whole nine like we all do. The problem is they can't receive it because they're here illegally or they're using a fake document. They can't use it. And even when it comes to other benefits like welfare, like food stamps and what have you, even if they have a citizen child, if the rest of the family is undocumented, that child will not get those benefits. So they put in more than they take out. That's a fact, right? Now we can talk about, well, do they have access to that? Well, you know, we all pay taxes. They pay taxes. It's like the famous Supreme Court case, Plyler versus Doe, which made the argument that undocumented immigrants are allowed a public education. It was filed in Texas. They were arguing that they shouldn't because they're not citizens. Well, the Supreme Court, which was at the time, it was when Sandra Day O'Connor, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, was just put on there, argued a couple of things. Number one is that there's no constitutional right to citizens to have an education. So this is not really a constitutional issue. The second argument that they made was that since public schools depend on property taxes or local taxes to function, the undocumented people pay property tax. They're like, well, they're renting. Well, it's incorporating their rent to pay property tax. So they're paying for that school, so therefore they should have access to that school. And that's the standard to this very day. Now, there's been many attempts, especially in Texas actually, to try to revised this decision, that was Pyler versus Doe in the early 1980s, to revise this, but regardless, you can't get past the fact that local taxes support local schools. And when we go to the gas pump, it doesn't ask us, are you a citizen or not, so you can pay the gas tax or not. It doesn't ask us that, we just pay it, right? Just like immigrants. They pay it, they pay food sales tax, they pay all kinds of taxes that all lead to either county hospitals or schools or what have you. They pay them as much as we do, right? Deportation, these are 2 incidences where we've actually done it already. So this idea that we're seeing, it's not new. We did it in the 1950s, the relatively most recent, the Operation Wetback. Yes, that's the actual name of the policy under Eisenhower, who had installed a general as the director of INS at the time and wanted to install a military operation in dealing with unauthorized immigrants. This was in the middle of the Bracero program. It was a highly political issue that Eisenhower felt he had to address. He does it. They do it for about a year, year and a half, and then they stop. They claim victory. The problem is that no. Why? Because like everything, it was expensive. There's way more than they thought. And when they first took them, like say for example, they got them, they took them to Juarez, leave them there, don't come back, okay? Next day, our boss wants us back, so they go, okay, we learned our lesson. We're not gonna leave you in Juarez, we're gonna leave you in Veracruz or in Mexico City. Well, shoot, it's only gonna take us now 5 days to get back as opposed to 5 hours to get back. Because the employers, the farmers are like, we need them, right? So they were basically undermining the law enforcement at that time, right? So it would stop, it would consider it a success, but we look at the numbers, it really did nothing to curb or decrease the number of unauthorized immigrants coming to this time. Finally, it's complicated. It really is. I don't want to be too reductive on it, but it is highly complicated. You know, I thought I had it here, but I didn't. For example, construction. It's not bodily functions coming out of me or anything like that. No, but we look at construction. 25% of the workforce is undocumented. Those who put food on our tables, you're looking at about 80% are foreign-born. At least half are undocumented. So you want to take them all out? We don't eat. In 2010, Georgia passed one of the most draconian anti-immigrant laws in the country. Immigrants left Georgia fields. They had billions of dollars rotting. It was also at the time where unemployment was still relatively high from the Great Recession. The United Farm Workers teamed up with the Colbert Report and teamed up with the Department of Labor. Hey, let's recruit, man. We got jobs now. Georgia has one of the highest unemployment rates, around close to 10%. We got jobs. You guys said that they're taking our jobs. Here are jobs. I think 50 people showed up at their one site. After a day, that was half. By the end of the week, only 7 were there. And by the following week, none. And these are people who didn't have jobs before. And not to say these are more than just, immigrants are more than just laborers, they're people, right? So it's not to say that, hey, we need them to do jobs that we don't like to do. Well then, what does that say about us? I don't like to use that term because it's like, yes, but how is it that we're too good? I mean, we think we're Thomas Jefferson and Gentleman Farmer. We're like, hey, I love farmers, but I'm not gonna pick up a shovel. That's not us, right? So we have to think about that, and just that it is complicated. Anyway, I've gone over my time. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I hope that this was helpful. One more thing real quick. After this, if you're interested in helping some of the local people who are impacted by current policies or current executive orders or what have you, Ms. Gracie Gomez is organizing people to help, whether it's helping them fill out paperwork or taking them places or just comfort, whatever it may be. If it's something you want to do, please contact Ms. Gracie Gomez right there. Raise your hand, Gracie, yeah? And then she'll be happy to help you out. Thank you, I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, I hope I can